Let's pray. Oh God, speak to us this morning. And let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Omri was a young boy, and he was about to have a birthday. His very best friend gave him something that he just knew he was going to love. It was a little plastic Native American figurine. And he knew that Omri loved Native Americans and playing with them and cowboys and Indians, and he also knew that this would be the thing that he could play with him. Omri had a big imagination. But on that birthday, he also got something else that was really special. He had a big brother, and his big brother was walking by an alley one day, and he saw in the alley something that was special, and he could tell. He went to it, he looked at this old, beat-up cabinet. He wondered, what I could do with this. I think I'll give it to my little brother. He will love it for his birthday. And so Omri, on this birthday, got a very special old cabinet that probably had lived many lives, and he got this little figurine. And after he got it, he found the cabinet door was locked, and so to unlock it, he went to his mother's keys, and he went through every single key, and he found one. It was an old key that belonged to his great-grandfather, and he was able to make that cabinet open. And so he did what any little boy would do. He took his little figurine and locked it in there for safekeeping. Well, guess what happened the next day when he decided to get his figurine out? That little figurine had become alive. His name was Little Bear, and he wasn't little by personality standards. He was very small, but he had a lot of demands, and he ended up being a lot of fun for both Omri and his best friend, Patrick. Do you remember that story? It's a story that captured me as a child. The story from The Indian in the Cover. Whether toys come to life for us, or whether we hear about them in stories or in movies like in Toy Story, or whether a stuffed animal might come to life like in The Velveteen Rabbit, or Corduroy the Bear, it would seem that we humans have a natural desire to understand everything that we are in relationship with, even things that aren't sentient, even things that can't think. I think that's why these stories keep flying off the bookshelves and flying off the DVD racks. I think we are wired to understand who we are in relationship with in the world, whether they are people or whether they are toys or pets. I think we're wired to try to be in relationship with everyone, to be loved, to love. Young Omri quickly learned that cowboys and Indians hate each other. We end up learning all about his world and how he begins to order his world. Children learn every day all about Barbies that care for fashion and hair, and G.I. Joes that care about battling, and most children have to figure out who they are and which one they want to play with. Now, I admit, a lot of it is developmental, right? We know this, that when you're young, everything is very concrete. It's important for us to understand how the world fits together when we're young. It's important for us to understand that policemen protect us, to understand that teachers are going to be there to help us learn, that crossing guards will help us cross the street, and mommies and daddies will love us. But as we grow up, we begin to see that the world is a little bit more complicated than when we first thought. For instance, when we're young, we come to church, and we might consider Christians everyone that comes to church with us. We might get a little bit older, and we might say, well, actually, what I've learned is that being a Christian means that I've been baptized. So a person who's baptized is a Christian. And maybe then we continue to grow in our faith, and we might say, well, wait, being a Christian probably is more like just wanting to be like Jesus. So our definition might change a little bit. And then when we get really old, well, I heard Maya Angelou say once, she said, I don't know how anyone can consider themselves a Christian. She said, I've been trying my whole life, and I know I can't do it. We know that identity is important, and that it's important to understand who we are and who we are not. As Americans, as Democrats, as Republicans, As veterans, as disciples of Christ, it is important to understand what it means to be whoever we are. But yet, we also have to transcend that. The ancient Israelites knew this better than anyone. And we get the Hebrew Bible that is constantly defining and redefining who the Israelite people are as children of God, over and over again. And while the story this morning can feel like a relic of the past, we continue to share it as a people of faith, because somehow we know that this story is our story. To catch you up on what you just heard, the book of Ruth opens up with a tale about an ancient family in ancient Israel. To our modern way of thinking, we might just say, well, they're a Jewish family, but really that wouldn't be quite fair. This is a family that belongs to a very unique understanding of the world, with very unique customs and habits, of understanding not only who God is, of who their nation is, of who their family is. Their faith is all encapsulated. You might say that's still true. This family, parents Naomi and Elimelech, they're starving. There's a famine in Israel, and so they travel with their two sons, their sons whose names are Chilion and Mahlon, and they go to a place called Moab. They have to leave their homeland, leave the place where they are doing the same customs as everyone else. They have to go to a place where they are foreigners. And while they're there, Chilion and Mahlon, their sons, they get married to Moabite women. And the worst thing happens that can happen when you're in another land. The patriarch of the family, Elimelech, he dies. We're told that he dies, and then 10 years later, for 10 years, these two sons who had been married to Moabite women, these two sons die too, in a foreign land. We don't know anything about how they died. All we know is that there are 3 widows who remain. It is said that to know love is to know pain. And a widow knows this more than anything. And the book of Ruth opens with this pain on the surface, with Naomi, the worst pain. Not only having lost a husband, but having lost her only 2 sons. This is something I do like about the Hebrew Bible. The fact that the writers made no pretenses about that pain. To know God does not mean that we won't know pain. Ruth has already suffered. She's already had to go, or not Ruth, Naomi has already had to go to Moab. She's had to endure this difficult life, a different life than she had put in for. And now, while she's been in Moab, she's experiencing more pain. To know God does not mean that there will be no pain. Perhaps that fact is important for our identity too, as people of faith. After that shock and sting of losing her sons, reality begins to set in. I'm sure she begins to wonder, what am I going to do? What's going to happen to me as I get old? Who's going to take care of me? This retirement plan that I had is not going to work. It's not a surprise that in the first chapter, Naomi shares that she wishes to return to her homeland, the only link to her past, the only hope for her to find anybody that might be able to take care of her. The plight of her daughters-in-law was not that much easier to swallow. They too had entered a time of deep darkness. They too had to begrudgingly face the fact that to love is to know pain. Orpah and Ruth would know the pain of loving these men, of getting to know a whole different way of life, of learning about new customs and a new God, of adapting to a new religion that no doubt they loved. But now they were no longer wives. They were widows. Their identities had changed in an instant. They were no longer at the beginning stage of their life, but in the hard later years, with no clear ideas about what's going to happen, no children, nothing. It's Naomi who makes the decision. Naomi says, "Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband," she says. "Even if I thought there was hope for me, and even if I should have a husband and have a son tonight, would you wait for them to be born? Would you refrain from marrying so you could marry them?" we're told that both Orpah and Ruth wept aloud, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. The moment when they could no longer hold on to the belief that this chosen life would work, and they had to let go. The instant when that denial of pain would no longer be an option. Those moments are indescribable, and choices are often inexplicable. Why one would choose to stay with Naomi and the other would choose to go back to her own family? I would suggest neither of them, but still, it was a choice. Badawi was on Tahrir Square protesting an unfair government in December of 2011. This young woman was in her early 20s from a good family in a small town outside Cairo. At the same time, and still, she is attending university. But at that time, she was caught in a wave of revolution. It was in the air. She joined the multitudes that balked at Mubarak's regime and loudly and proudly used her voice against the rampant oppression that was in Egypt. She knew that she was part of something bigger than herself, and she knew that change was imminent. She wouldn't describe herself as a liberal woman. She followed Islamic law. She dressed conservatively. She respected all the elders in her family. But she knew she had to stand with those people. She knew she had to lend her voice against this cruel and oppressive regime. During this particular December protest, she was accosted by soldiers. They pulled off her headscarf. They dragged her across the square. They punched her. They took her all the way to an interrogation office some meters away, several hundred. The event ended with her in a hospital, getting 25 stitches, many broken bones, and having to face charges that she had attacked the police. When her family found out about it, they blamed her. They didn't support revolution. She ended up locked in her room for the better part of this year. In fact, she's rebuked by her family and receives beatings if she leaves and comes back after curfew, if she's able to get out. Like many women in Egypt, the revolution that she fights is both on a national stage and at home. She continues to go to secret meetings when she's let out to go to college, but she knows she has limits. It's a world that most of us cannot fathom, with very few rights for women, with a constant threat of abuse. Badawi, in an article I read, was recently offered a scholarship to get out. A university in Australia offered her a way out, but she knows that to leave without the blessing from her family would be the same as cutting off her family, cutting off her identity as an Egyptian woman revolutionary altogether. And so she stays. Her choices are few, and one could easily describe those choices as bad and worse. But for Badawi, she is sure of the choice she has made, at least for now. At the crossroad when choice is no longer something to be put off, Ruth knew her path ahead, and Orpah knew hers. Perhaps it was the love of Orpah's family that she decided to go back to the life that she once knew 10 years ago. Maybe Ruth really loved Naomi. Maybe she really loved this new God, these new customs. We don't know. What we know is that on a very gut level, Ruth chose differently. And it was no small choice. It was one she would have to live with for the rest of her life. But I think that somewhere deep inside, she was able to know what she was choosing. I get from her words that she said to Naomi that she was comfortable with that choice. When she said, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, even more, if death parts me from you." Ruth chose her identity in that moment. She would throw her lot in with the Israelite God, Yahweh, and the people with whom she had made her life for the last 10 years. Everything in this story is all about identity. She could choose to be defined by her birth parents. She could choose to be defined by her customs in Moab. She could choose to be defined by the Israelite ways, by the love of the God that she has now known. And somehow she knew. Perhaps the time she spent with God helped her know. Maybe it was that she just had the courage. That's what leads us to the scripture that you just heard a few moments ago. That's how we end up in this crazy situation with two women in a male-dominated, patriarchal society. These two women who are strong, but they are starving. Who are poor, who are in need, and they are without any benefactors. No one to make sure they'll be well, no social net to catch them, but gleaning fields from the workers and taking the food that people left over in the farms. And so we hear about how they scheme. Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, I need to seek some security for you. Here's what you should do. Wait until our kinsman, Boaz, who's a really good man, wait until he's been drinking. Take advantage of him. I need to seek some security for you. I think it's fair to say that these two women have choices that are less than ideal. Ruth to try to win the marriage of a man who's much older than her, we're told. One that she doesn't even know. And Naomi to have to depend on this daughter-in-law of this possible marriage. Surely they could have just continued to beg for scraps from the farmhands. They could have assumed a life utterly dependent on the kindness of others, or maybe they could take advantage of this good man. The choices were less than ideal. I wonder if this story is important to our identity as people of faith because it addresses the messiness of life. We know something of difficult choices in this world. Whether we are talking about common people who are trying to protest regimes that we know are unfair, whether we're talking about our own choices and choosing between political parties that tend to paint everything in black or white, or red or blue, leaving so little middle ground for discussion, or whether we are trying to learn how to rebuild a city after a hurricane when we know that the warming of the planet is just going to continue to make things worse, or whether we're thinking about a national budget and all the services that might be cut that could throw us into another recession. We know that difficult choices are part of life. And we choose with the best of them. We hope we're choosing wisely too. In the story of ancient Israel, Naomi has lived long enough to know how women can survive in this culture. It's not pretty. But Boaz is a good man, and she thought there is a good possibility this could turn out well. And young Ruth is mentored by this mother-in-law. And here's the good news. God somehow is present through all of it. That's our promise to us. We see it in the positive outcomes. We see that Boaz does show devotion to Ruth because of her love for Naomi. He's touched by that. We know that Boaz does marry her, that they are able to bear a son, that Naomi is able to be taken care of, and this son becomes the grandson, the grandfather to David, the father, the greatest king that the Jewish people have known, that we have known, a man that we Christians say is a descendant of Jesus. But we know that God is with us in the negative outcomes as well. We know that God is with us in the positive outcomes, and it assures us that naming of God in particular times that we can fathom that God is actually with us the whole time. Somehow in this story of transferring of identity, we learn that to be a child of God is not to get a life free of pain. To be a child of God is not to know exactly what the right decisions are, maybe even who we are at times. But it is to know this. It is to know that when we accept our primary identity as a child of God, we are able to move about in this world and work for God. We are able to understand who we are as children and loved by God. That is what I choose to take from this story of Ruth. When Ruth was able to make that profession of identity, her life begins anew. She's able to use herself. God is able to use her for God's work, and she is even able to bear a son that we know would have great work in God's hands. This is our story. Perhaps proving once again that God does not work in a neatly controlled box, but out of chaos, out of messiness. God can create a new home, can create a new family. God can create a new church, and God is creating in us. Who will you say that you are when the moment comes and the decision is yours to choose?